What's going on, guys? Alex here with TFLnow. Naked sport bikes are becoming very popular, and it's probably my favorite class of motorcycle. And back at the end of 2019, Ducati announced their new Streetfighter V4 and V4S. And I had the chance to go check it out in person in Denver ahead of its release later this year. So in this video, I'm going to give you a full walk around of the bike, tell you all the specs, let you know every single detail about this bike. That's coming up right now. So let's start out with the design. This is basically a Panigale V4 stripped of all of its fairings and with a wider and taller handlebar. They basically took the Panigale V4 track bike and made it more street oriented. So to talk about the design a little bit, up front you see the V-shaped running light, which mimics the Panigale V4 running light pretty much exactly. And they also made this really unique LED front headlight assembly that's supposed to mimic the look of the Joker, the cartoon character. It looks really cool, and you can see right here kind of a comparison of where they got that inspiration from and where the headlight ended up. Now, one of the main things you'll notice right away about the new Streetfighter V4 and V4S are these massive wings on the front end. They're called biplane wings. There's two of them on each side, and they're not there just for looks. They're actually very functional. So on a naked sport bike, what ends up happening is you're kind of leaned a little bit further back, and because you're not leaning down on clip-ons, you're using a more standard handlebar. Your body acts like a sail, and then it kind of forces you to pull up on the handlebars. So naked sport bikes are very prone to wheeling very easily. And these wings actually put a ton of downforce on the front wheel and keep the front wheel planted when you're accelerating very hard. This allows them to minimize the rake and also keep a shorter swing arm. I'm not sure if the swing arm is exactly the same length as the Panigale V4, but without these biplane wings in the front, they would need a much longer swing arm to reduce that wheeling effect.
These winglets that are on the front of the motorcycle help create a downforce on the motorcycle, which actually puts about 60 foot-pounds of downforce on the motorcycle at 167 miles an hour. So why is that good? Well, because when you're accelerating on the motorcycle heavily, it helps keep the front end down without having to use electronic intervention. And then also when you're going into corners, it helps keep you stabilized. And under hard braking, it keeps the front end from getting a little greasy. It's not a technical term, but from shifting as you're riding, as any hard deceleration, you sometimes can get that. This keeps the front end planted without having to use electronic intervention. Last year, when this bike was in development, we had the opportunity for a really cool placement in a movie that's coming up with Ryan Reynolds called Free Guy. Okay. And so we built two of these bikes in the US with basically rapid prototyping parts that we put on the motorcycle. And those early versions didn't have the winglets. So when you see the movie, when it comes out this summer, you'll see that it doesn't have the winglets on it. But as the engineers were testing the motorcycle still into the spring and summer of last year, they realized that in order to get the right ergonomic triangle in terms of the rider sitting comfortably on the motorcycle, but still having enough of his own weight on the bike to the front end to give it good control, that it needed something in order to help keep the front end down. And so we ended up adding the winglets after, let's say, the initial design of the motorcycle was done.
So let's talk about the engine a little bit. This uses the 1100cc Desmo Sedici Stradale engine pulled right out of the Panigale V4. It's a 90-degree V4 and it has a counter-rotating crankshaft. So what that means is the crankshaft actually rotates in a reverse direction, and that kind of cancels out the gyroscopic effect that you would find on a lot of sport bikes. And what that means is when you're leaning into a turn, it's going to feel like a much smaller bike than it actually is. This is an 1100cc bike, but with that counter-rotating crankshaft, it's going to feel like a 300 when you're tipping into corners. Now, while it is the same engine pulled directly out of the Panigale V4, it is tuned differently, so the final ratio is a little bit shorter, and that allows for better torque on the road. So you're going to have more torque throughout the entire power band. You're not going to have to rev it all the way out to the top to get your power on the street. As far as specs go, it's pretty insane. This thing makes 208 horsepower and 90.4 foot-pounds of torque at 11,500 RPM. 208 horsepower on a naked sport bike. That is just ridiculous, and it is class leading. Just to compare that to some of the competition, that's more power than the Kawasaki ZH2, more power than the MV Agusta Brutale 1000RR, and more power than the new KTM Super Duke R. That 208 horsepower can also be up to 220 horsepower with the addition of an Akrapovic full titanium racing exhaust, which also will shed about 6 pounds off the weight of the bike.
And the other probably most exciting accessory for these motorcycles is the dry clutch, which is something that Ducati is traditionally known for, having the rattle of a dry clutch. I'm pretty confident we're going to see people retrofit the dry clutch to this bike as well.
Gotcha.
Plus all the carbon fiber that you can consider.
Now there are two different versions of the Streetfighter. There's the V4 and the V4S, the V4S being kind of the higher end model. And with that V4S, you get aluminum forged wheels versus the aluminum alloy cast wheels that you would find on the more basic model. And surrounding those wheels are Pirelli Diablo Rosso Corsa 2 tires. And these are very high performing tires. You can definitely take them on the track, but the compound is a little bit different than what you would find on something like a Panigale V4. They're supposed to perform better in low temperatures, so you're not going to have to heat them up with tire warmers before you want to go take them out on the street. So obviously more set up for street use. And they're also going to perform decently well in wet conditions, which is something you're not going to get on a fully focused track tire. Now, as far as the riding position goes, I did have the chance to sit on the bike, and I've ridden a bunch of naked sport bikes, and most of the time you're very upright. And while you're not really hunched over as much on this Streetfighter as you are on, let's say, the Panigale V4 or any other super sport bike, your legs are still very far kicked back. You're still lean forward. The rider triangle is still somewhat aggressive. So this isn't just going to be good on the street. This is definitely something you can take on the track. As far as weights go, the V4 weighs 397 pounds. It goes down to 392 pounds if you get the V4S, and those are dry weights. Wet weights, you're looking at 443 pounds for the V4 and 439 pounds for the V4S, and that is the best power to weight ratio in this segment of motorcycles. Now this bike tops out at around 290 kilometers per hour. That's 180 miles per hour. Again, just insane numbers for a naked sport bike. Absolutely ridiculous. And it's not an electronically limited top speed. It's limited by that final ratio. So that's why the top speed is a little bit lower than the Panigale V4. And this is also the most powerful naked bike in production. So obviously they're going for numbers here. I really hope I get a chance to ride one of these because I'm sure it is just mind-blowing. Okay, so let's talk about the suspension. Suspension varies a lot when you go from the V4 to the V4S. So let's start with the V4. On the V4, you're going to get a Showa front fork. You're also going to get a Sachs rear shock and a Sachs steering damper. And those front forks are fully adjustable for preload and compression and rebound damping. And then on the V4S, you're going to get a suspension upgrade. You're going to get Öhlins all the way around. So Öhlins front forks, Öhlins rear shock, and Öhlins steering damper. And all of that is electronically controlled. As far as brakes go, up front we have dual Brembo monoblock calipers. Each of them has 4 30mm pistons, and those grab onto 330mm discs. Then back in the rear, we have a single 245mm disc clamped by a 2-piston caliper, and you get a really advanced ABS system in this bike. It uses the 6-axis IMU to detect your lean angle in a turn, and so it will know how far you're leaned over, where you are in the turn, and know what to do with the ABS system.
When you're going into a corner and you're leading in, if you grab the brakes, that the ABS braking is modulates knowing that you're in a corner, and it knows how far over you are at a corner. Because you get too far in a corner, you obviously don't want to grab brakes, but in an emergency situation, you can.
Now there is a ton of tech in this bike. So we'll start out up front by the dash. This has a 5-inch TFT screen, which is the same screen you would get on the Panigale V4. And it has 2 layouts, one for track and one for road. So if you're in that track mode, you're going to have a lap timer, which is super cool. And then if you switch into the road display, you're going to have a multimedia system, and they're also going to change the rev scale for road use. So the RPM range will look a little bit different on the road version, but that multimedia system allows you to answer calls, respond to texts, and change your music via Bluetooth right on that screen in the front of the bike. Now, like I said earlier, there is a 6-axis IMU, detects roll, yaw, and pitch. Super advanced system. There's a lot of tech in this bike, so I'll just fly through some of these real quick. Like I said earlier, ABS cornering, Ducati traction control with 8 different modes, Ducati slide control, wheelie control, power launch, quick shift up and down, so that would be basically rev matching and auto blipper. You don't need to use the clutch to shift up or down. Engine brake control, and of course, electronic suspension.
So it has 3 different modes. You can program each one of them so that you can have your city mode or urban mode with a high horsepower and high traction control, if you want to show off, but be safe. And then for the track, you can turn it all the way off if you put it into race mode. So these are some of the things that you can do with it. And then on the S model, it also has what I think is a great feature, and that's the electronic suspension. So when you change the riding modes, and you can change the riding modes on the fly as you're riding, it will actually change the suspension settings so that you have something that is much more compliant and softer, let's say for the streets, and will absorb more of the bumps, or something that's much more rigid if you're on a very smooth surface and you're riding fast on the track where you need every bit of feedback. And then it probably is the coolest piece of it is the dynamic suspension. If you put it into dynamic suspension mode, it actually will adjust as you're riding. In each one of the riding modes, the power of the engine delivery power is adjusted as well. So that when you're in the urban mode, it actually delivers the power in a much more linear way, and it cuts the top horsepower. But you can change it to a different mode. Sport, it gives you full horsepower, but a very nice transition of that. And when you put it in race, it's a very direct throttle and all power.
Now, one thing Ducati was very clear about is the service intervals for this bike. One of the kind of classic Ducati stereotypes is that you have to have your valves checked and adjusted every 6,000 miles. And with the Streetfighter V4 and V4S, they say you only have to check and adjust the valves every 15,000 miles. So they're breaking away from that classic Ducati stereotype.
So pricing starts at $19,995 for the standard model, and deliveries will start in April of this year. We anticipate for the first few months it's going to be more demand than supply as expected, because there's been a lot of demand on the bike right now, but we'll see it arrive kind of mid-April.
Just to give you a little idea of where that compares to the Panigale V4, the V4 starts at $21,995 and the V4S at $28,395. So this does come in a little bit cheaper than the Panigale V4. And then to compare it to some of the competition, I think this pairs up really closely, at least the V4, with the new Kawasaki ZH2. That's their supercharged naked sport bike based on the H2 SX, and that comes in at $17,000. I think that bike pretty closely compares to the standard V4. So as far as pricing, yes, the ZH2 is a little bit cheaper, but you expect to pay more for the Italian brand. The Super Duke R starts at $18,699, so again, just a little bit cheaper than the Streetfighter V4. And another bike this is probably going to be compared to is the Aprilia Tuono V4 1100 Factory. That comes in at $18,999, so just $1,000 cheaper than this Streetfighter V4. And then to kind of take it to another level, you have the MV Agusta Brutale. That is $31,998, which obviously is much more than even the V4S model. But that's a pretty rare bike, and it's kind of a stretch to compare it to the Streetfighter. I still can't get over that 208 horsepower figure. It's just mind-blowing. I really hope I get the opportunity to ride one of these bikes, because I'm sure it just kind of tosses you back. Even with those wings up front, you're still gonna feel the power and your butt's gonna sink right into that seat. So this is a really, really badass bike. It's a total track weapon that you can take on the street. It's still gonna have lots of torque to get you around town, and you're not gonna have to really crank through every gear like you would on a Panigale V4. Let me know what you guys think of this new Streetfighter V4 and V4S. Do you think it's too much power for a naked sport bike, or do you think those wings up front are really gonna do their job and help this bike stay planted and make it a really enjoyable street and track weapon? Let me know. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to go back to TFL Off-Road, TFL Car, and TFLtruck.com for more news, views, and real-world reviews.